The next morning, I arrived at Giant Stadium with my own truck with what we needed to put these antennas on the Empire State Building, and a convoy of relief workers and myself included. We drove through the Lincoln Tunnel into New York because there was no other traffic, but we had a police escort and very surreal.
September 11, 2001 is remembered for its profound human tragedy, but behind the scenes, it also presented an unthinkable challenge for broadcasters. How do you get back on the air when your transmitter site no longer exists? At the time, many of New York City's major TV and radio signals originated from the North Tower of the World Trade Center, which in an instant was gone. The result? A broadcast blackout for the estimated 20% of the region that wasn't connected to cable or satellite, and instead relied on over-the-air signals through rabbit ear antennas. Cable and satellite systems weren't spared either. Many providers depended on over-the-air signals from broadcasters rather than direct fiber connections. In the chaotic days after 9/11, some stations scrambled to restore temporary signals from the Empire State Building. But for the long-term solution, a new hub emerged, the Armstrong Tower in Alpine, New Jersey, the birthplace of FM radio. Join me as we explore the technical, logistical, and equipment challenges of getting New York's broadcasters back online after one of the darkest days in modern history. This is Inside the Broadcast, 9/12, back on the air.
I can't believe how strong this wind is.
We want to welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world.
And welcome inside the broadcast, everybody.
Hello, friends, and welcome inside the broadcast to our first episode of 9/12, back on the air. Today I'll speak with Andy Bader, formerly of Tribune Broadcasting. Andy was at the heart of the effort to not just get his own station, WPIX, back on the air, but as you'll hear in this episode and future ones, he was a uniting figure among the different stations, working with engineering counterparts across New York, as well as local and federal officials. Here's our conversation with Andy Bader. We begin with him speaking on his role with Tribune Broadcasting at the time of 9/11.
On 9/11, I was the director of RF projects for Tribune Broadcasting. So I worked on transmitter sites, transmission systems, including TV transmitters, satellite transmitters, Advanced Television Systems Committee technologies. I also worked on FCC filings for our television stations. So on 9/11, as it would turn out, I was not at the World Trade Center, even though often I would go to the World Trade Center on the way to my New York City office. But on the morning of 9/11, I had a meeting, curiously, in northern New Jersey, not far away from the Alpine Tower. And I was fortunately not on site. And so when the phone started to ring and people started to tell me what was happening, my first inclination was to get in the car and go there. But then, we all subsequently saw what happened, and that's part of the story. So in that, I was a member of the broadcast community. Obviously this was a quite tragic event for us. I had a coworker who I talked to just before he was killed, while he was trapped up there, which is a conversation that will forever be burned in my psyche, I guess. And I knew a number of the other broadcast engineers that were killed, and I knew a number of other people that were killed. And my family was also freaking out because they didn't know where I was at the time. So we started to think about what we could do when the World Trade Center was destroyed. I had been a person that coordinated a lot of the work in New York City atop the World Trade Center and the Empire State Building. And so the afternoon of 9/11, I put the word out that the broadcasters should gather on a telephone call so we could discuss what had happened. And so the television engineers in New York City, we all got on the phone and talked about what had happened. And obviously, it was very difficult because a number of our coworkers were missing. We didn't know what had happened to them at that point. We clearly feared the worst. And we talked about what we could do. A plan was hatched, I think on that call or shortly after, for us to meet subsequently at WABC. WABC had been a kind host for a number of our meetings as we worked on coordinating activities atop the Empire State Building and the World Trade Center. And so later that afternoon, I'd also been in contact with our legal counsel in Washington, and we got a hold of very senior people at FEMA. And we started to talk about how we were going to respond to this situation. I had a conversation with FEMA about how to get back into the city. The city was basically, it was a one-way environment. The city was shut down. You were not able to get back in for a few days. And so we made arrangements for FEMA to have a number of us that wanted to get back into the city to meet at Giant Stadium the next day. What we were doing, I was working, helping coordinate the overall activities to the extent I could, but I was also helping to restore our operations at WPIX TV. And so we had a transmitter, a small transmitter, and we had some antennas, and they were stashed to be used at the Empire State Building, but we did not have all the right brackets for the antennas. So on the afternoon of 9/11, we called the manufacturer and said, could you make some brackets for us? And the manufacturer actually was only a few miles away from Shanksville. And their staff had all gone home because they didn't, no one really knew what was happening in the world at that point. So they fortunately, they called their staff back in and they welded up brackets for us. And another engineer in a Tribune company drove across Pennsylvania to get them, and arrived at my house at, I think, like at 11 o'clock at night with these materials. And the next morning, I arrived at Giant Stadium with my own truck with these what we needed to put these antennas on the Empire State Building, and a convoy of relief workers and myself included. We drove through the Lincoln Tunnel into New York because there was no other traffic, but we had a police escort, and very surreal. I would say, a very, very unusual circumstance. And that, I brought that material in, and the first thing WPIX did is we put up a small 1 kilowatt transmitter at the Empire State Building. And we secured the help of electrical contractors, and we began work on that. That's the first thing that we were working on. And then later, I think it was later that day, and again, Justin, this is 23 years ago, so my memory's a little fuzzy on all the exact timeline, but I think later that afternoon, or it may have been the next day, but we met at WABC. And so that was a long day. 9/12 was a really long day. I'd gotten almost no sleep the night before, and obviously it was very traumatic for all of us. And so for WPIX on 9/12, we were building up a temporary transmitter in Empire State Building. I knew the director of telecommunications in the Empire State Building pretty well. We were building this up. There were threats that something bad would happen in the Empire State Building. We didn't know what was going on. We didn't know whether, if you were up on the Empire State Building, you were going to be killed as well. You didn't know whether something bad was going to happen. Of course, the airspace was closed everywhere, but you still didn't know. So we built this system for WPIX, and then I met with my fellow broadcasters up at WABC, and I think it actually was WABC who had suggested that they were interested in moving to a temporary location at Alpine Tower. And that actually, given the uncertainty of what was happening in the world, New York, Washington, that made great sense. It was a location outside the city. We felt that should be probably more easily securable. And so WPIX actually continued to build a small transmitter in Empire State Building, but we also pivoted to build a much larger facility at Alpine Tower, along with other broadcasters, because again, we felt this could be secured. And and mind you, for a number of weeks, I think it was probably weeks, you have to talk to Chuck Sackerman, but a number of weeks, there were people patrolling the Alpine site, I think actually with machine guns. I mean, it was pretty intense. We did not know what was happening, but it was a facility that was easily guarded. And so, we turned to build facilities at Alpine. There were a lot of logistics issues that, I guess I was one of the key people helping to coordinate. We needed to add electrical capacity. We had to be sure that there were structural capability on the Alpine Tower. We needed to find space in the buildings at Alpine. And even to the extent that we needed to be aware of what was happening from an RF radiation perspective. Alpine is in a actually very expensive residential neighborhood, and we knew that at some point someone was going to ask about potential impact from that perspective. And so within, I guess, a few days after we started to mobilize there, I also got in touch with at that time the nation's foremost RF radiation expert, and he drove out to meet with me, and we began that work. And so the Alpine site was an unbelievable hub of activity. It's sort of hard in retrospect, and I wish I had taken pictures. This was a time nobody had cell phone cameras at that point, and none of us were smart enough to document what was going on. But it was just a beehive of activity. The transmitter manufacturers had helped out. They pulled transmitters off of the production line that were going to go to other broadcasters, and they were able to send them to New York, and they retuned things, and things were driven across the country. Very senior people from the transmitter manufacturers came to Alpine because for a good part of time there was no air travel. So senior managers, I remember quite vividly, Joe Mack, who's actually just now retired from Harris, drove across the country from Cincinnati to visit with us. And so we got unbelievably good support from the transmitter and antenna manufacturers as we determined how to build these temporary facilities on Alpine Tower. And that was our focus for the first month or so. And then we recognized that there were limitations with Alpine Tower. It's not as centrally located to the metropolitan area as Empire State Building. And so we started to talk about how we could build replacement facilities in the Empire State Building, which was also complicated by the need to add electrical power and figure out structural issues and logistics of moving people around. And so that was also on I guess that was a phase 2 of the recovery. And so I worked on that too, arranging for temporary electrical power riser up the Empire State Building, and talking to antenna manufacturers about how we would put things on the building and et cetera. And that, this is all more challenging than it might be today, because this is at a time when everything was done via fax. This was, largely most of us weren't using email very extensively. We phone bridges, et cetera. And so, there was a number of, in-person meetings, but, we figured all of that out.
Wow, certainly a lot there with that answer. If you're able to, take our listeners through why Alpine was a good location. Obviously, it was the birthplace of FM radio, but not necessarily a hub of activity at the time of 9/11. So what made that location work?
Well, I think at the time it was appealing because it was actually outside the city, and we all had worked extensively with the Empire State Building. I'd actually worked quite a bit with the Empire State Building, and it's challenging, very challenging to do stuff on the Empire State Building. So Alpine, we could mobilize to faster, and I think that was of great value during that time period. You could bring materials to Alpine with greater ease than you could bring materials into the Empire State Building. The Empire State Building, everything has to be a certain size so we can get in the elevators, and there are structural limitations. And again, we didn't know whether it was still going to be a target. So Alpine, as an initial stopgap location, served us well, and it helped us for that first couple of months until we could figure out how to build better facilities back in the Empire State Building.
How long were stations planning on using Alpine?
There was a period where it was probably more palatable to have multiple locations and spend the money to fund a site in addition to Empire. But my understanding is over time that as we became a little more comfortable with what was happening in the world, it was no longer necessary. So, but at that time, the time of 9/11, there was so much going on. There were anthrax attacks happening, and there was always the specter that something else bad was going to happen. And remember that many of us had also lived through the 93 bombing at the World Trade Center, right? So the notion that there could be some subsequent terrorism that would disrupt the Empire State Building it was not out of the question. So for a while, maintaining duplicate operations certainly made a lot of sense.
In the time right before 9/11, we were starting to see the use of digital transmitters in New York City. And I'm curious, post 9/11, obviously with this equipment shortage, were digital transmitters used, or was there sort of a scramble to just find whatever type of equipment could be found, even if it was analog?
So at that time, digital penetration rates had not really taken off yet. So the broadcasters focused on building analog facilities, and analog equipment was more readily available. But it is true that a number of the broadcasters working with CBS, who was the lead on an antenna project at the World Trade Center, we had just recently begun broadcasting high definition signals from the World Trade Center. So we lost all that infrastructure, and so it was a while after 9/11, after we restored analog as full power as we could, analog facilities in New York, that we turned to building rebuilding the digital infrastructure.
You would have had a relatively high wattage antenna at the World Trade Center, and now you're scrambling to get antennas at Alpine. So I'm curious, like, that was supposed to be a long-term project. Obviously, if you said that they were still in use at the time of the blackout, this is now several years. So I'm curious, was coverage of the New York City area similar, even though Alpine Tower is obviously far north of Manhattan?
Yeah, so coverage of the New York City area was not as good from Alpine, from a couple different perspectives. One, it's a little bit outside the geographic center of the market. Two, even if we had liked to have dramatically increased the power from Alpine, we all have to remember that there are other television stations in nearby markets that we would potentially interfere with. And so though that would also have been a barrier to reducing power or increasing power quite a bit. The biggest challenge with Alpine was that it had difficulty penetrating into the buildings in Manhattan, Brooklyn, et cetera. Its ability for the RF signals to get down into the canyons of the avenues up through Manhattan into the Bronx, streets in Brooklyn and Queens was limited. Where in the World Trade Center sat up high and looked down into those avenues, Alpine was basically shooting through buildings to get to those streets and avenues, and that was a challenge. That was a really big challenge. And so if you were watching Alpine in a suburban area where you didn't necessarily have that difficulty, it was probably better. But in the city itself, it was not as good. And we learned this very quickly. And this was one of the reasons why, broadcasters, we all turned towards making the Empire State Building the phase 2 recovery site, because the Empire State Building is in the heart of Manhattan, and the antennas can look down into the city infrastructure.
You're listening to Inside the Broadcast and our conversation with Andy Bader. Andy, I'm curious, under such tight deadlines, what was the involvement of the FCC like at the time?
Well, the FCC was incredibly helpful. There were the special temporary authorizations that were often, our attorneys, our Federal Communications Commission attorneys that the broadcasters had would submit them, and they'd be returned very quickly. So I don't recall any significant barriers. We did have to be clear that we would be addressing things like RF radiation, and that we weren't going to interfere with other broadcasters in adjacent markets. But the folks at the FCC were incredibly helpful in getting things done.
Can you explain the interactions between the different stations who were presumably all working under the same interests at the time?
These are television stations that compete with each other, but at the engineering level, many of us had worked with each other and collaborated on a number of technical projects. And as I said, that I was the person that often coordinated that kind of joint work, RF radiation studies or shutdowns, et cetera. And so engineers help other engineers. There were a few discussions about who would go where on the Empire State Building, and a little jockeying here and there, but generally there was a great pulling together of the television stations to work together, and I think that they could all be proud of that. This was one of the most significant attacks on American soil that we'd had since Pearl Harbor, and for the most part, some of the competitive issues were sort of put aside so we could all work together.
So 9/12 obviously was a day where there wasn't a lot of over-the-air broadcasting going on. How quickly did those first signals get back over the air?
It's important to point out that CBS still had a television transmitter in the Empire State Building, and the stories are widely known about why that was, and they were able to turn that transmitter back on. And so they provided some over-the-air capability to the market, which was wonderful, right? So if you were a person that didn't have cable television, then you would be able to at least watch CBS and see what's going on. I think that our WPIX facility might have been the next one on, because we had bought some disaster material, antenna and transmitter after the 93 bombing. And so we had things available. We just didn't have all the pieces parts, which is why, after the 9/11, I'm on the phone, arranging to have welders make brackets for these antennas, and why we were bringing all this stuff in the morning of 9/12. I'd have to think. I'm not sure. I don't honestly remember whether we got on in the afternoon at 9/12 or 9:13. It's a while ago, but I think we were able to get together a very temporary lash up with an antenna facing north out of the Empire State Building, and that of course had limitations because we weren't sending any signal to the east or to the west or to the south, right? And so we got something on the air, and if you're a broadcaster and you're off the air, getting something on the air is better than nothing, right? So I'm proud that we were able to pull that off. The interim signals that Alpine provided were in many ways better than even what we had at the Empire State Building, but in some ways not. So it's hindsight is 20/20.
Can you explain just a little more in detail 9/11 itself, in terms of knowing that you're going to have to figure out how to get back on air with obviously this tragedy happening? I would assume the colleague that you lost was Stephen Jacobson.
That's correct. Yeah.
So, I mean, just can you take me through that day as much as you're comfortable with? And I understand if you can't talk about it as well.
That's a very that was a very difficult day. As I mentioned when we got on the Zoom here, my first inclination when I heard something had happened was to call up there, and I got a hold of Stephen, and it was a very short conversation. And my next inclination was to drive into the city. And then I shortly realized after the second plane hit that was not going to work, right? So then I took to, all right, well, I'm home. My family did not know where I was, because I often was at the World Trade Center. So there was an assumption that I was probably there, because I often went on my way to the office. One of the things I did is I went and retrieved my daughter from school, because my daughter had heard what was going on, and she also, my family basically thought, I had been there. So I retrieved my daughter from school, and I talked to my wife. It was my wife worked in Manhattan, so she was in Manhattan that day, and so we talked about how what was going on, and that she also had to go through extra effort to get home, because getting out of the city was, even later in the day, was a problem. And so since I was home, and since I had been, like I said, the person that had coordinated a lot of the work among the broadcasters, I turned my attention to helping WPIX, which was my primary duty, and B, starting to figure out what we were going to do. What was the broadcast industry going to do? How were we going to come back from this? That it's basically, for a few months, that's primarily what I focused on.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Andy Bader. Andy was the first person willing to speak to me on the record about this project, and I couldn't be more grateful for his time. On our next episode, we'll speak to Joe Mack of the former Harris Communications, now known as Gates Air. We'll talk about the logistics and equipment efforts that went into getting broadcasters back up and running after 9/11. This series was dedicated to Rod Coppola. Don DeFranco, Steve Jacobson, Robert Pattison, Isaias Rivera, and Bill Stackman. All were broadcast engineers who lost their lives at the World Trade Center on 9/11. May they rest in peace, and may their memories be a blessing.